Under the original draft of this bill, a minister could have approved a project that benefited their own investments, and no one would have been the wiser. We also saw that this bill, as originally drafted, would have given the government too much power. And so we fought back and we won.
Bill C-5 was sent from committee back to the House of Commons today, where the proposed amendments would be reported on, debated, and voted on by the House. What happened?
Let's take a look. Whenever committee is working on something, whether it be a study or whether it be reviewing a bill, there is a stage that is called report stage. Now, it's usually a report stage when it comes to a bill, but they still have to do a report when they're doing a study on, say, a Can or a scandal or something like that. So in the report stage, when it comes to a bill, it's usually going to have a report that says, here's what we found, here's proposed amendments that the committee has voted on that passed through into the report, this is what we recommend to the House. Now, when a bill comes back to the House in report stage, it's usually going to be concurred in. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that somebody from the committee reads the report or submits the report from the committee, and then what happens is the House debates what was actually in that report. So that's what happened with Bill C-5 today. Why is that important? Well, because the bill didn't come back from committee the way it went in.
Right.
There was a bunch of amendments that were voted on, as we talked about in our last video, that took out all of this control grab legislation that was in the bill, which would have made it, well, a lot easier for the government to skirt legislation. So naturally, these amendments, you would want them to be debated in the House in order to flush them out. So report stage began early this morning, and the debate happened all day, and then they voted on these amendments. So they looked at every single amendment that was submitted and voted successfully in committee, and then that was put to a vote of the House. Some amendments were accepted, some were not. The good news is that all of the amendments that the Conservative put forward that were the important ones that had to deal with preserving the, let's just call it, additional controls that they put into this bill and the legislation they took out of the bill to prevent this centralization of power and ability for the government to skirt conflict of interest and suspend legislation as they would like. All of that passed. So that was preserved in the bill.
So the good news that we delivered yesterday regarding committee changing Bill C-5 stayed.
And then they went to debate a few more times as it relates to the bill in its new form, in its amended form, before the actual vote. And the first Conservative up to speak was our former MP in our old riding, Dan Muse.
Mr. Speaker, we are now at third reading of Bill C-5, our final opportunity in this House to speak to this legislation before it moves to the Senate. So let me start here. Canadians are not short on talent. We're not short on ambition. We are certainly not short on natural resources. But what we are short on is a government that knows how to unleash that potential and gets things built. And I hear this all the time. People are ready to work. Businesses want to expand. Communities are waiting for critical infrastructure, but over and over again, we run into the same thing. Bureaucratic bottlenecks, overregulation, and a government more interested in announcing headline-grabbing projects rather than permitting economically important ones. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is about getting big things built, and that should matter a whole lot. But faced with the economic challenges of their own creation, this Liberal government has said numerous times recently that this is the moment. Well, you know what would have met the moment? Scraps Bill C-69. Scrap the shipping ban, the oil and gas production cap, and the industrial carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, at committee, Conservatives rolled up our sleeves and got to work. And we saw that this bill created a series of loopholes that would have allowed ministers and the Prime Minister to bypass Canada's ethics laws, the Conflict of Interest Act, lobbying rules, the protections under the Criminal Code, and the Auditor General Act, amongst others. And so, under the original draft of this bill, a minister could have approved a project that benefited their own investments, and no one would have been the wiser. So, Mr. Speaker, we also saw that this bill, as originally drafted, would have given the government too much power. And so we fought back and we won. With the support of opposition colleagues, Conservative MPs, passed amendments to close loopholes, ensured stricter controls, and brought about transparency and accountability. We made sure that public office holders must recuse themselves in the event of a conflict. We established a mandatory national security review for foreign state-owned proponents. We added a public registry of projects, clear rationales, and a timeline to publish criteria within 15 days of royal assent. And we created a mechanism for parliamentary oversight requiring regular reporting. And we mandated public consultation reporting. And we forbade the government from exercising these extraordinary powers when Parliament is dissolved or prorogued. Mr. Speaker, Conservatives made this bill better. We delivered transparency, oversight, and guardrails. And I want to thank my colleagues on the Transport Committee for their hard work. But let me be clear. While we made it better, we cannot pretend that this bill is the be-all and end-all of meeting the moment. So let's look at part one of the bill, which is about free trade and labor mobility within Canada. And it sounds ambitious, but in reality, it's far more limited. There are no binding timelines, no penalties for delays, no incentives for provinces to actually remove trade barriers, and no framework for a Blue Seal licensing standard that would allow professionals such as engineers, nurses, skilled tradespeople to work across the country based on national credentials. At committee, we heard from Catherine Swift, President of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada, who summed it up well. Canada has been talking about internal trade for 3 decades, report after report, announcement after announcement, but still not nearly enough meaningful action. So the fear is that this bill will only add to that pile, and it would become just another press release without a solid plan to move forward, which is why Conservatives have been proposing a better way to provide financial incentives for provinces to eliminate barriers, which would be a win-win, which would boost GDP, which would increase revenues and allow provinces to reinvest in important infrastructure projects. And the IMF has estimated that removing internal trade barriers could raise Canada's GDP by as much as 4%. And that's real growth, real paychecks, and real opportunity. But very little of that is in C-5. So again, Mr. Speaker, this bill does not do enough to seriously address the economic headwinds that Canada is facing. So now into part 2 of the bill, the Building Canada Act. This section is supposed to fast-track major projects that are in the national interest. But instead of real reform, we get a selective shortcut. All the red tape and bills like C-69 and C-48 remain in place. And there's no clear criteria for what makes a project eligible. There's no certainty for investors, just more discretion handed to the ministers who have failed to deliver time and time again. Yes, Conservatives improved the bill at committee, but flaws remain. We heard from Dr. Xenia Pirot, who's Director of Energy and Natural Resources and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, at committee. And she warned us very bluntly that global capital is mobile. Investors are not going to wait around for a country that takes years to approve a pipeline or transmission line. In fact, they aren't waiting. They're going to the United States. They're going to Australia. They're going to Norway, to countries with the same environmental standards, but faster, clearer, more reliable approval processes. We can't ignore the warning signs. Canada has dropped in global rankings for competitiveness. A lack of clarity, slow timelines, and politicized approvals are driving investment away. Conservatives believe in a better path, one-and-done approvals, a national energy corridor, shovel-ready zones. We all want to see projects proceed, worthy projects, not just the ones that are politically favorable that particular week or month. And we're in an era of fierce global competition, urgent infrastructure needs, and historic opportunity. And while this legislation sets a framework, there is more to be done. There needs to be a clear model for approvals, and impediments to approval need to be cleared, such as again, C-69, C-48, the production cap, the industrial carbon tax.
So, wanted to let everybody hear a lot of that speech that Dan Muse was talking about there, because he lays out the fact that they've gutted all of the problematic parts of this bill in terms of the negative aspects of this bill.
Yeah, they closed those loopholes that would have given the ministers even more power.
Right. The issue is that there's a whole bunch missing from this bill. What's missing is repealing C-69 and the transport ban and many other aspects that are slowing everything down and preventing us from actually moving forward. So, but he touched on it, and we talked about this in the strategy video on our first C5 video, where we talk about the fact that the Conservatives have stated publicly on the campaign many times they are for building big projects. They are for building pipelines and other things like that. So if they voted in principle against this bill, they would get crucified by the Liberals and give them all of the ammunition they need, possibly to even win a majority in the next election. So when it comes to the core of this bill, they're saying, you know what? Sure, it moves us ahead a little bit,
but it doesn't go far enough. Yeah.
But this is where they're hedging their bets and saying, so, you know, we're voting for it because it's moving us ahead, but the Liberals have to get it done, and the Liberals have trouble getting literally anything done. And they had industry experts look at this bill and say, sure, you moved it forward an inch, but this isn't hardly enough. And remember, Carney has made all of these public, very public promises. He even had the king come over and read them in the throne speech. So all of Canada knows what Mr. Carney has promised, and it's going to be difficult for him to deliver. So after these speeches, there was more debate, and then everything kind of wrapped up by 5:15, and then they went to the votes.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Carney.
Mr. Carney.
The question is as follows. Monsieur Leblanc, seconded by Mrs. Freeland, moved that Bill C-5 enact free trade and labor mobility in Canada. Shall I dispense? Puis-je dispenser? La période est 10 minutes pour les députés votant par voie électronique.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of these clauses will please rise.
Mr. Carney.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Freeland.
Madame Joly.
Madame Joly.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. Hodgson.
Mr. Hodgson.
Ms.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Madame Michel.
Madame Michel.
Mr. Solomon.
I'm going to guess that those folks are new to Parliament.
Probably, and Mr. Carney, being new, didn't sit down after they called his name. He doesn't seem to understand that because he's the Prime Minister, they'll call his name first and then they'll call everybody else. So he was kind of confused as to what was going on, because they called his name and then they went to the beginning of the row that he was sitting in. So it just screwed everybody up.
Yeah, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really a big deal, but it does look a little odd, especially when at the end of the last Parliament, we were used to seeing everything run very smoothly, especially when it came to the votes, because everybody had 4 years worth of experience.
Right. So, you know, like, I'll give these new Liberals a pass on this. Everyone's kind of getting used to this. So, you know, after a few votes, they will be in the swing of things, I'm sure.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 335, 335. Nays contre 1.
I declare Part 1 and the short title carried.
So as you can see, Part 1 of the bill was voted on and adopted. So part one, which is the free trade portion between the provinces, or at least that's what they're trying to sell everybody, that was passed. And after that, they went to part two, which was the actual national projects area of the bill.
The next question is on part two, including the schedule, which belongs to part two. La période de 10 minutes pour les députés votent.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of these clauses will please rise.
Mr. Carney,
Mr. Carney.
Mr. Ali,
Mr. Ali.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck,
Mr. McDonald. Malpeck.
Ms. Freeland,
Freeland.
Madam Judge.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 306, 306. Nays contre 31, 31.
I declare part two, including the schedule, carried. The House has agreed to the entirety of Bill C-5, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act and the Build in Canada Act at the third reading stage.
So this is exactly how our parliament is supposed to work. You're not supposed to have the government proposing bills and the opposition slamming them down no matter what. They are supposed to work together in the best interest of Canadians to make a bill the best it can be. Now, I'm not saying this bill is the best bill out there, but it's probably as good as it's going to get for this particular bill. And that's because you had the Conservatives vote after second reading to bring it to committee, where all the concerning parts were gutted and removed from the bill. Then it was brought back to the House and voted on as amended, and it passed.
And they're going to be reminding the Liberals that, hey, the only reason this bill passed is because of us. Just so you know, Mark Carney.
Well, and now the Liberals cannot use this as an election issue to say, hey, look at the Conservatives. We wanted to build stuff and they wouldn't let us. That's not the case at all. What happened was the Conservatives got rid of those loopholes that the Liberals were trying to include in the bill, made the bill, again, the best that particular bill could be, not saying it's a great bill, but it's the best it can be, and passed it through the House of Commons where it's going to go to the Senate.
Now that it's in the Senate, because it's past third reading, it goes into first reading in the Senate, and then after first reading, most likely it will immediately proceed to second reading, and then it goes through that process again. It'll be voted on, go to committee in the Senate, and then they will rip it apart again. Who knows? They may propose new amendments. They may not. If they do propose new amendments, it will come back to the House, where it will have to be voted on again before it goes back to the Senate. And then we will see what happens at that point, because if they, well, that's a whole other video in terms of what happens there. But assuming everything goes smoothly and the Senate doesn't add anything else, then they will then send it to third reading, vote on that, and then it will receive royal assent. So this is where it happens, and this is how our parliamentary democracy is supposed to work. So even though this is a Liberal bill, it's at least somewhat positive in that there's some sort of desire for building things in Canada, even though this doesn't go far enough. There's a lot of things that were pulled out of this bill that were very dangerous to our democracy, and to allow cabinet ministers to essentially skirt almost all of the legislation that we have in the interest of national projects. And it's just a good demonstration of how our democracy is supposed to actually function. So good on the opposition parties, because it was the NDP, the Bloc, and the Conservatives that all collaborated well in committee. Well,
right, because the NDP wasn't supposed to be there, but they did allow Ms. Gazan some time.
Right, and that was good faith on the part of the committee to allow them to do that. So you saw what happens when government works together. So this is it so far for C5. We will still keep our eye on this as this starts to navigate through the Senate, and If there's any updates where it comes to anything new regarding the bill, we'll be sure to let you know.